The United States and Soviet Union, the two world powers during the Cold War, one trying to show the other that their form of government, capitalism versus socialism, was the best. In the end, socialism was the form of government that failed and led to the collapse of the Soviet Union. In 1987, President Reagan said, standing at the Berlin Wall, "Freedom is the victor."
It is not the German question alone that remains open, but the question of freedom for all mankind.
But let's say things played out different. Let's say the Soviet Union was a capitalist country. This would make the Soviet Union and United States strong allies. If this was the case, how would things play out differently? Number 10. A good chance the United States could have stayed out of World War II. When World War II started in 1939, the United States wanted to stay out of the war. It wasn't until December 7th, 1941, when Pearl Harbor was bombed by Japan, then the United States decided it would fight. Also, the Soviet Union was on the side of Germany in the start of the war, helping Germany invade Poland in 1939. However, on June 22, 1941, Adolf Hitler betrayed and invaded the Soviet Union. Had the Soviet Union been on the opposite side from the beginning of the war, most likely they would invade Japan, since Japan sits only 3,627 kilometers, or 2,253 miles. Now, many may say that Russia is closer to Japan, due to the island of Kunashir, but that island was taken away from Japan by the Soviet Union after World War II, and to this day Russia has not given it back to Japan. So since the Soviet Union most likely would have invaded Japan during World War II, Japan most likely would have other things to worry about than to bomb the United States, probably letting the United States stay out of the war. However, this actually did happen during the war. Near the end of World War II, the Soviet Union felt that it was only a matter of time till Japan invaded them. Most likely they would have done it by coming in from China, which Japan was occupying during the time. So while the US was coming in from the south in the Pacific, the Soviet Union was coming in through the west, defeating Japan in China. And they soon were going to go into Japan. But once Japan surrendered in 1945, the Soviet Union pulled back. But you see, teamwork, the US from the south, the Soviet Union from the west, it was hard for a nation to beat the two when they worked together. Number 9. Germany would not have been split into two. After World War II, Germany was divided in half, the Soviet Union occupying half of the country, the United States occupying another half. Tension ran between the US and Soviet Union, as a small portion of Berlin also belonged to the United States, and another belonged to the Soviet Union. To keep the United States out, Joseph Stalin put up the Berlin Wall, which meant food and supplies had to be flown to the civilians that the US controlled in Berlin. Had the Soviet Union and the United States been allies, none of this would have happened. The wall would not have went up, Germany would not have been split.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
Number 8. The Cold War never would have happened. The two superpowers would not go against each other during the Vietnam and Korean War. In fact, they would be fighting with one another during these two wars. With the social government of Korea and Vietnam going against the two superpowers of the world, it would be incredibly hard for North Korea or Vietnam to win, and most likely the wars would tip in the United States and Soviet Union's favor. Number 7. North Korea would not exist. North Korea began at the end of World War II in 1945. The surrender of Japan led to the division of Korea at the 38th parallel, with the Soviet Union occupying the north and the United States occupying the south. The Soviet Union and the United States failed to agree on a way to unify the country, and in 1948 they established two separate governments, North Korea and South Korea, each claiming to be a legitimate government of all Korea. In September 15, 1950, General Douglas MacArthur successfully drove North Korea troops out of South Korea and went into North Korea, winning and reuniting the country. only to be met by Chinese forces, which pushed them back into South Korea. Had the Soviet Union and United States been allies, no doubt the Soviet Union would have got involved, aiding the United States in the Korean War, and also sending Soviet troops pushing into China, making the Chinese forces draw out of North Korea to defend their country, allowing the United States to push back into the north and unite the country. Number 6. China would be a capitalist country. China was at civil war around 1927, fought between the Kuomintang government, which was promoting democracy for the country, and the Communist Party of China, and continued until World War II, when the country united to fight Japan from invading them. However, after World War II, the fighting resumed, as the Communist Party gained vast area of the country and received aid from the Soviet Union as the Soviet gave the Chinese Communist Party weapons and supplies they captured from Japan during World War II to aid the Chinese Communist Party, letting the Communist Party gain the upper hand and pushing the Kuomintang down into Taiwan. Had things been different, there is a good chance the Soviets would have gave the weapons and ammo to the Kuomintang government and defeating the Communist Party of China, or pushing the Communist Party into Taiwan, and Taiwan being a communist country. Now, before anyone says that Taiwan is a part of China, just to let everyone know so that everyone is up to date, Taiwan speaks its own language, has its own currency, and even has its own president. And they have their own elections, electing leaders and representatives for Taiwan, not China. Number 5. NATO would not exist. Probably. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization, founded on April 4th, 1949. The treaty states that if an armed attack occurs against one of the member states, it shall be considered an attack against all members part of NATO, and members of NATO can defend that nation militarily. General Hastings, the first commander of NATO, said the reason NATO was formed in the first place was to keep the Soviet Union out of Europe. After World War II, the Soviet Union started to expand across Europe and Asia. A lot of Europe were worried that it would only be a matter of time until the Soviet Union invaded them. To prevent this, many key leaders of the Western countries agreed on creating NATO. This way, if the Soviet Union did invade any country that is part of NATO, they would not just be going up against that country, but a number of countries. Smaller countries could be more secure knowing other countries would be there to defend them, and countries could focus more on their economy rather than fund military. Not only that, but this allowed the United States to have better access into European countries, to be closer to the Soviet Union in case of an attack. But if the Soviet Union was an ally rather than an enemy, NATO most likely would not exist. If it was created, it would have been created for a different reason, and probably much later. Number 4. Cuba would be an American ally. During the Cold War, after the establishment of diplomatic ties with the Soviet Union, after the Cuban Revolution of 1959, Cuba became increasingly dependent on the Soviet Union, on Soviet markets and military aid, becoming an ally of the Soviet Union during the Cold War. That was until the collapse of the Soviet Union, to which Cuba entered an era of economic hardships. However, if the Soviet Union was a capitalist nation, then they would not have aided Fidel Castro, the Cuban Missile Crisis would not have occurred, and Fidel Castro would not have risen to power, or would not have been as powerful as he was. Number 3. Millions would not have died under the Soviet Union rule. During the time when the Soviet Union was forming and Joseph Stalin was taking power, millions died as Stalin killed millions to assume his right to rule over the people of Soviet Union. He killed millions due to famine or torture or execution. It is not certain how many people died during the time of Joseph Stalin's reign. Many say over 20 million, but the number is uncertain. What is certain is Stalin was just as bad as a tyrant as Adolf Hitler. The reason many don't learn this is due to the fact Stalin helped win World War II, and the events of what he did was so horrific, many don't want to discuss it. Had the Soviet Union been a capitalist country, millions would not have died. Number 2. We might have already landed on Mars. During the Cold War, the race for space was on. Both countries trying to beat the other to space, seeing who could get into space first. However, the Soviet Union won that race on April 12, 1961. cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin became the first human to travel into space. During the flight, the 27-year-old test pilot and industrial technician also became the first man to orbit the planet. The Soviet Union seemed as though they had a big advantage on the race after they sent the first man into space. The next year, in 1962, they sent a space probe to land on Venus, sending pictures and information back to Earth. However, the probe did not last due to the harsh conditions and soon gave out, but it was clear to see who was winning this race. That was until September 12, 1962, when President John F. Kennedy made his famous speech.
We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon.
Soon another race was on to see who could get to the moon, the United States or the Soviet Union. But if the two nations worked together, one nation accomplishing putting a probe on another planet, the other nation accomplishing putting a man on the moon, who knows, a man most likely would have already walked on Mars. Now most people say the moon landing is a fake. The United States has never reached the moon.
I don't believe we landed on the moon.
If so, how do you explain Apollo 13?
Houston, we have a problem.
The crew lost control of the ship and had to slingshot around the moon to get back to the Earth. If Apollo 13 was able to reach the moon, but not land on it in 1970, isn't it possible for Neil Armstrong to get to the moon in 1969 and walk on it? And number one, September 11th most likely would not have happened. In December 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, and the United States aided the Mujahideen by sending weapons and supplies, leading to the defeat of the Soviet Union. There were a certain people who were considered war heroes during the Soviet-Afghan War, such as Osama bin Laden, which made him have a lot of followers, and create Al-Qaeda, which led to the terror attacks on September 11th, 2001, and led to the United States going into Afghanistan and the war on terror happening. Had things played differently, none of this would most likely not have happened. The Soviet-Afghan War would have never taken place, which means key terrorist leaders like Osama bin Laden would not have had followers due to the defeat of the Soviet Union. However, let's say the war did happen. The US would have helped the Soviet Union instead and helped win the war in Afghanistan, which would have prevented 9/11. Not to say an attack on America would and could still happen. There most likely would be terrorist organizations who would be against America and its allies, including the Soviet Union, which would lead to an attack, and the war on terror would still probably happen, but it would happen in a different way, and no doubt the Soviet Union would be helping the United States with the war on terror. Do you agree with these predictions? Do you have any other insights on what could have happened if the Soviet Union was an ally of the United States? Leave your comments below, and please remember to share and subscribe.